Most people think tea is the safest thing they drink, but according to multiple consumer tests and safety reports, certain teas sold today have been found to contain heavy metals, pesticide residues, and synthetic additives that don't belong in a daily drink. Over time, these findings have raised red flags through recalls, testing, and investigations, details that rarely make headlines or reach the average shopper. In this video, I'm breaking down 15 fake tea brands you should avoid, based on what's really inside them and how they're made. Along the way, I'll also point out 4 better tea brands that are actually safe to drink. And at the end, I'll show you how to spot real tea on your own, so you can make smarter choices no matter what brand you're looking at. Let's start with the brands to avoid. Tea 15. Yogi Tea. Yogi Tea is widely trusted because it markets itself as herbal, organic, and rooted in traditional wellness practices. However, consumer testing and regulatory scrutiny have previously raised concerns about pesticide residues detected in certain Yogi Tea blends, including products sold under organic-style branding. These findings didn't come from rumors. They came from testing and compliance checks that flagged residues above what many consumers would expect from a clean tea. This matters because tea plants readily absorb chemicals from soil and water, and those residues don't disappear when the leaves are dried. When you steep tea in hot water, you're not just extracting flavor, you're extracting whatever remains on those leaves. The issue isn't that every Yogi Tea product is unsafe. The issue is that the brand has been flagged before, and most consumers were never made aware. For something people drink daily, even occasional contamination is worth paying attention to. Branding alone is not a safety guarantee. Even wellness-focused tea companies can fall short. And if this surprised you, Tea 14 involves a brand that built its entire reputation on being 100% natural. Tea 14. Celestial Seasonings. Celestial Seasonings is one of the most recognizable tea brands in the world. It's often associated with natural, caffeine-free herbal blends and has built its reputation on being clean, gentle, and safe for everyday use. However, that image has been challenged. Independent testing and legal actions have previously raised concerns about pesticide residues detected in some Celestial Seasonings teas, including products marketed as 100% natural. These findings became public through lawsuits and follow-up testing that questioned whether the brand's labeling accurately reflected what was in the tea. Why does this matter? Because natural has no strict legal definition in tea labeling. A product can carry that language while still containing trace residues from agricultural chemicals used during growing or processing. When those leaves are steeped, residues can transfer directly into the drink. What made this case especially concerning to consumers was not just the presence of residues, but the gap between marketing and disclosure. Many buyers assumed that 100% natural meant pesticide-free, even though that wasn't guaranteed. Celestial Seasonings has stated that its products meet safety standards, but the fact that concerns surfaced at all is the point. When a brand built almost entirely on trust and purity is questioned, it shows how little most consumers actually know about tea sourcing and testing. Marketing language like natural or herbal does not equal chemical-free, and it's often used without full transparency. And the next brand is even more concerning, because what was found doesn't show up on labels at all. It shows up after brewing. Tea 13. Louisiane Tea. Louisiane is best known for its iced tea and family-sized tea bags. It's inexpensive, widely available, and often treated as a staple, especially in households that brew large batches regularly. What put Louisiane on this list wasn't marketing language or vague claims. It was what showed up after the tea was brewed. Consumer testing previously found concerning levels of lead in brewed tea samples from this brand. That detail matters. Lead isn't always obvious when you look at dry tea leaves, but once hot water is added, heavy metals present in the leaves can leach directly into the drink. Tea plants naturally absorb elements from soil, including heavy metals. When sourcing comes from regions with contaminated soil or poor oversight, those metals can remain through processing. Unlike pesticides, lead doesn't break down, and regular exposure, even in small amounts, can add up over time. For people who drink iced tea daily or brew large quantities for families, this becomes more than a one-off concern. Lead exposure has been linked to neurological issues, especially in children, and there is no safe level of lead consumption over the long term. The issue here isn't panic, it's awareness. Most consumers assume contamination would be caught before a product reaches shelves, but in reality, many of these findings only come to light after independent testing, not proactive disclosure. What cases like this show is that the problem isn't tea itself, it's how some brands handle sourcing, testing, and quality control. Not every company approaches tea the same way, and before moving on, it's worth pausing to look at what a better standard actually looks like, so you have something real to compare these brands against. Safe to drink tea. 4. Numi Organic Tea. Not every tea brand cuts corners, and this is where knowing what to look for matters. Numi Organic Tea is often cited as a stronger example because it uses whole leaf tea rather than finely ground dust. When you open the bag, you can see intact leaves and herbs, which reduces over-processing and helps preserve quality. The brand is also transparent about where its tea is sourced and uses plastic-free tea bags, avoiding the issue of synthetic materials being steeped in hot water. Ingredient lists are clear and minimal, with fewer vague, natural flavor additions. This doesn't make it perfect, but it does show what higher standards look like when leaf quality, sourcing transparency, and packaging are treated as priorities. Unfortunately, that level of transparency and quality isn't consistent across the industry. As the next brand shows, when tea is produced as a low-cost private label product, oversight often drops, and the risks don't disappear, they just become harder for consumers to see. T12 from Great Origins. From Great Origins isn't a brand most people recognize by name, and that's part of the problem. It's a private label tea often sold in bulk or under store brand style packaging, which gives consumers very little information about sourcing or quality. What brought this tea into focus was independent consumer testing that, like the previous brand, found lead present in brewed tea samples. Again, this wasn't about how the tea looked on the shelf. It was about what ended up in the cup after steeping. This matters because private label teas often rely on cost-cutting at the sourcing level. Leaves may come from multiple regions, blended together with minimal transparency. When soil quality, harvesting conditions, and testing standards vary, contaminants like heavy metals can slip through unnoticed. Unlike premium brands, these products rarely explain where their tea is grown or how often it's tested. And because they don't carry a strong brand identity, problems tend to attract less public attention, even when the findings are just as serious. For consumers, this creates a blind spot. A low price and plain packaging can feel honest, but in reality, it often means fewer safeguards and less accountability. This is another example of how heavy metals in tea aren't limited to one company or one type of product. They show up repeatedly when sourcing and oversight aren't treated as priorities. And next, we're moving away from heavy metals to a brand where the concern wasn't contamination, but a recall tied directly to ingredient handling and supplier control. T11. Herbalife Relaxation Tea. Herbalife's teas are marketed less like beverages and more like wellness products. They're often positioned as supplements, sold through distributors, and promoted for specific effects like relaxation, energy, or weight support. The concern here isn't vague suspicion, it's tied to a documented recall. In the past, a recall was issued for Herbalife's relaxation tea after it was discovered that an incorrect ingredient from a supplier had been used in production. That means what was inside the product didn't fully match what consumers believed they were drinking. Why this matters is simple. When teas are blended like supplements, ingredient control becomes critical. A single sourcing or labeling error can introduce compounds that were never intended to be consumed, especially by people drinking these products regularly. Unlike traditional tea brands, products like this are often consumed daily as part of routines built around health goals. When something goes wrong at the supplier level, the risk isn't theoretical. It affects real consumers who trust the product for its supposed benefits. This case highlights a recurring pattern in the tea space. The more a product promises specific health effects, the more important transparency and oversight become. When those controls slip, even once, it raises questions about quality assurance across the board. And next, we're moving away from supplement-style teas to a household name, one that shows how large-scale production can introduce a completely different set of problems. T10. Lipton. The issue here isn't speculation. Lipton has previously issued product recalls tied to labeling errors, including cases where ingredients were incorrectly listed or undeclared, such as sugar content in certain tea products. That may sound minor, but it isn't. For people managing health conditions like diabetes, allergies, or dietary restrictions, inaccurate labeling directly affects safety. When a tea product doesn't match what's printed on the package, consumers lose the ability to make informed choices, even if the ingredient itself isn't toxic. Large-scale production adds another layer of risk. When millions of units are produced across multiple facilities, a single mistake can spread widely before it's caught. In these cases, Recalls usually happen after the product has already been sold and consumed. Lipton has stated that affected products were removed once identified. But the takeaway is broader than one recall. It shows how size and speed can work against quality control, especially when tea is treated as a commodity rather than an agricultural product that varies by source. This is another reminder that familiarity doesn't equal oversight, and even brands that feel safe by default can fall short when transparency breaks down. Up next, we're going to pause again and look at another example of what higher standards actually look like, before continuing with brands that show the opposite. Safe to drink tea 3. Single herb medicinal teas. At this point, a pattern should be clear. Many problems show up when labels are vague, sourcing is unclear, or production is scaled faster than oversight. This is where it helps to see what a more transparent approach looks like. Single herb medicinal teas is often cited as a stronger example because it treats tea more like a regulated herbal product than a lifestyle accessory. The brand is open about its ingredient standards, uses clearly identified herbs, and publishes information about quality testing rather than relying on marketing language alone. Another key difference is packaging. Traditional medicinals has publicly addressed tea bag materials, moving away from plastic-based bags and focusing on paper-based alternatives. That matters because anything used to steep tea is exposed to boiling water, not just the leaves themselves. Again, this doesn't mean perfection, but it does show what changes when a brand prioritizes ingredient clarity, testing, and disclosure instead of buzzwords. And with that contrast in mind, the next brand brings us back to the other side of the spectrum, where the concern wasn't labeling or sourcing, but contamination serious enough to trigger a recall. T9. Celebration Herbals. Celebration Herbals is often perceived as a small traditional herbal tea company. The branding leans heavily into purity, simplicity, and old-world herbalism, which makes many consumers assume the products are inherently safer. The issue here is not marketing language. It's a documented recall. In the past, Celebration Herbals issued a recall for certain herbal tea products due to possible salmonella contamination. That's a serious concern, especially for a product people drink specifically for digestive health or wellness support. Salmonella contamination usually points to breakdowns in sanitation during harvesting, drying, or packaging. Unlike chemical residues, this is a biological risk, and for vulnerable groups, including children, the elderly, or anyone with a weakened immune system, it can lead to severe illness. What makes this particularly relevant is that herbal teas are often consumed precisely because people believe they are gentle and restorative. When contamination enters the picture, that trust is directly undermined. The broader issue is that traditional or herbal doesn't automatically mean better oversight. Smaller brands can still struggle with quality control, especially if sourcing spans multiple suppliers or regions without consistent testing. This case reinforces a key point. Safety problems in tea aren't limited to big corporations or mass production. They can appear anywhere standards slip. And next, we're looking at a brand that faced similar concerns, not because of bacteria in the finished product, but because of a supplier issue that affected an entire blend. T8, the Republic of Tea. The Republic of Tea is often seen as a premium brand. The packaging feels upscale, the pricing is higher, and the messaging focuses on quality, ritual, and wellness. Many consumers assume that level of presentation means tighter standards. The concern here comes from a precautionary recall tied to a supplier ingredient that was suspected of salmonella contamination. While the issue originated upstream, it still affected finished tea products that reached consumers. This matters because it shows how even well-positioned brands rely heavily on their supply chain. Tea blends often contain multiple ingredients sourced from different regions, and when just one component isn't properly handled, the entire product can be compromised. In situations like this, recalls are often issued out of caution rather than confirmed illness, but that doesn't make them insignificant. It highlights how fragile quality control can be when sourcing isn't airtight from start to finish. For consumers, the key takeaway is that price and presentation don't guarantee immunity from contamination issues. A premium image doesn't eliminate agricultural or handling risk if oversight breaks down at any point. This is another reminder that problems in tea don't always come from what a brand does intentionally. Sometimes they come from what slips through unnoticed. And coming up next is a case that goes a step further, where the issue wasn't accidental contamination, but the discovery of ingredients that were never supposed to be in a tea at all. T7 WS Global Herbal Pain Relief Tea. tea. This product was marketed as a natural herbal tea designed to relieve pain, something many people would assume is gentle, plant-based, and safe to drink. But this case crossed a much more serious line. Regulatory investigations found that this so-called herbal tea contained hidden pharmaceutical drugs, including prescription-grade anti-inflammatory and steroid ingredients. These substances were not listed on the label and should never have been present in a tea product. That means consumers weren't just drinking herbs, they were unknowingly ingesting drugs that can carry real side effects, interactions, and risks, especially with long-term use or when combined with other medications. This wasn't a labeling oversight or a contamination issue. It was a case of adulteration, where a product was made to appear natural while delivering undisclosed medicinal effects. That's one of the most serious violations in the food and supplement space. For viewers, this is a critical reminder. When a tea promises strong physical effects, like pain relief, skepticism is necessary. Tea is not supposed to act like a and when it does, something is usually wrong. At this point in the list, if you're finding this information useful, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps this kind of investigative content reach more people who assume products like these are harmless, and it lets me know to keep digging into topics like this. By this point, it should be clear that safety issues in tea don't only affect cheap or unknown brands, they can appear even in products positioned as premium. But that doesn't mean every company operates this way. Some brands do take extra steps to avoid the problems we've been talking about. Safe to drink tea. 2. Pukka herbs. After seeing how contamination and sourcing issues can surface even in premium-looking teas, it's important to understand that these problems aren't unavoidable. Pukka herbs is often cited as a better example because of how openly it addresses ingredients, sourcing, and packaging. The brand uses organic herbs and clearly lists every ingredient in its blends, avoiding vague terms like natural flavors or proprietary mixes. One of the most important differences is the tea bag itself. Pukka has publicly stated that its tea bags are plastic-free and home compostable, which reduces the risk of synthetic materials being released when the tea is steeped in hot water. Pukka also places more emphasis on traceability, sharing information about where its herbs come from and how they're handled. While no brand is perfect, this level of transparency makes it easier for consumers to understand what they're actually drinking. Compared to many of the brands already discussed, this approach highlights what higher standards can look like in practice. Simpler ingredient lists, clearer sourcing, and packaging that doesn't introduce unnecessary risks. Unfortunately, that level of care isn't consistent across the industry, and the next tea shows how the risks can escalate when oversight doesn't just fail, but is completely ignored. Tea. 6. Mood 33. Hemp-infused. Herbal tea. Mood 33 positioned its teas as part of the wellness trend, combining herbal blends with hemp-derived ingredients and marketing them for relaxation and mood support. The issue here came from regulatory review, not rumors. Authorities issued a warning after finding that Mood 33's hemp-infused teas were adulterated and improperly marketed, meaning the products did not comply with food and supplement regulations. The concern centered on how hemp-derived ingredients were being used and presented in a tea product without meeting required standards. This matters because hemp and CBD-related ingredients sit in a legally sensitive area. When brands rush products to market without clear regulatory approval, consumers are left exposed to uncertainty, not just about legality, but about consistency, dosage, and safety. In cases like this, the problem isn't always immediate harm, it's the lack of oversight. When a product falls outside regulatory compliance, there's no reliable guarantee that what's in the package is consistent from batch to batch. For tea drinkers, this highlights another risk category entirely: wellness teas that blur the line between beverage and supplement without meeting the requirements of either. And next, we're moving back to a more traditional tea company, one that still ended up facing a recall over contamination concerns that had nothing to do with hemp or supplements. T5. Narada tea. Narada is a long-established tea producer, particularly known in Australia, and often associated with large-scale, mainstream tea supply rather than niche wellness products. Despite that reputation, the brand has previously been involved in a retail recall linked to contamination concerns. The issue wasn't about marketing claims or added ingredients. It was about safety controls failing somewhere between sourcing and finished product. When recalls like this happen, it usually points to problems in handling, storage, or supplier oversight. Tea is an agricultural product, and without strict controls at every stage, Contamination can occur even in well-established operations. What's important here is that this wasn't a fringe or experimental product. It was a mainstream tea sold through major retailers. That reinforces a recurring theme in this list. Familiarity and longevity don't automatically translate to consistent quality control. For consumers, this shows how little visibility there often is into how tea is processed before it reaches shelves. By the time a recall is announced, products may have already been purchased, brewed, and consumed. And next, we're looking at a brand where the concern wasn't general contamination, but a processing issue, serious enough to raise alarms about one of the most dangerous foodborne risks. T4, the chai box. The chai box built its reputation around small-batch, artisanal chai concentrates. It's the kind of brand people trust because it feels handcrafted and more personal than mass-market tea. The concern here came from a formal recall tied to processing issues. Certain chai products were recalled due to the potential risk of Clostridium botulinum, a bacteria that can grow when beverages aren't processed or acidified correctly. This isn't a minor issue. Botulism is rare, but it's one of the most dangerous foodborne threats when conditions allow it to develop. In products like chai concentrates, which are often stored for extended periods and sometimes diluted at home, proper pH control and processing are critical. When those safeguards fail, the risk isn't theoretical, but it's serious enough to trigger immediate recalls. What makes this case important is that the product looked safe, premium, and carefully made. But safety doesn't depend on branding or intention. It depends on strict processing standards being followed every single time. This highlights another blind spot for consumers. Smaller or artisanal doesn't always mean safer. In some cases, limited scale can actually increase risk if food safety systems aren't as robust. After hearing about issues like this, it's easy to feel like the entire tea industry is a gamble. But there are brands that approach tea very differently, with more restraint, more transparency, and fewer shortcuts. Safe to drink tea. 1. Rishi tea. Rishi tea is often mentioned by tea professionals because it focuses heavily on whole leaf and loose leaf tea, rather than finely ground dust sealed into bags. One of the biggest differences is visibility. With whole leaf tea, you can physically see what you're brewing. Intact leaves, stems, and herbs, instead of powder. That alone reduces overprocessing and makes it harder to hide low-quality material. Rishi is also more open about origin and sourcing, often listing regions, estates, or harvest styles. This level of detail isn't common in mass-market tea, but it's important because tea quality and contamination risks are closely tied to where and how leaves are grown. Packaging is another distinction. By emphasizing loose leaf options, Rishi reduces reliance on tea bags altogether, avoiding concerns about bag materials being exposed to boiling water. This doesn't mean it's the only good option, but it shows how simpler products, fewer blends, and clearer sourcing can reduce many of the risks we've been discussing. And the next tea on the list shows how problems can arise even without contamination, simply through how products are formulated and sold. T3. Harmony Chai. Harmony Chai sells chai concentrates that are treated more like bottled beverages than dried tea. The brand was involved in a product recall due to potential botulism risk, linked to improper processing and pH control. This is a serious food safety issue, not a minor quality concern. Botulism is associated with improperly processed liquid foods, and products like chai concentrates require strict controls to prevent bacterial growth. When those controls fail, recalls are issued because the health risk can be severe. This case is important because it shows how tea concentrates carry different risks than traditional loose leaf or bagged tea. Even when ingredients appear simple, processing errors can create dangerous conditions. For consumers, the takeaway is clear. Liquid or concentrate style tea. Products deserve extra scrutiny because mistakes in processing can have serious consequences. And next, we're looking at a tea that raised concerns not because of safety contamination, but because of how it was regulated and sold. T2. My Chai Inc. My Chai produces ready-to-drink and concentrate-style chai products, which places it in a higher risk category than dry tea leaves. The issue here was a formal recall tied to unsafe pH levels. Testing found that certain products were not properly acidified, creating conditions where harmful bacteria could potentially grow. For liquid beverages, pH control is a basic safety requirement, and when it fails, recalls are issued immediately. This matters because consumers often treat chai concentrates like regular tea, storing them casually and consuming them over time. But liquid products don't have the same safety margin as dried leaves. If processing controls aren't exact, the risk isn't theoretical. What this shows is that not all products sold as tea carry the same level of safety by default. Once a tea becomes a liquid concentrate, it depends entirely on strict manufacturing controls, not tradition, branding, or ingredients. And next, before the final item, we'll pause briefly to look at one more example of a brand that avoids many of these risks by keeping things simple and transparent. Tea. 1. Unregistered, imported tea products. The biggest risk in the tea market doesn't always come from well-known brands. It comes from unregistered or improperly imported tea products that bypass standard oversight entirely. Regulatory agencies have issued public warnings against certain imported teas that were found to be unregistered, meaning they were sold without approval, inspection, or verified safety controls. In these cases, authorities couldn't confirm sourcing, ingredient accuracy, or contamination testing. That's a serious problem. When a tea product isn't registered, there's no reliable way to know where the leaves were grown, what chemicals may have been used, how the tea was processed, or whether it was tested at all. These products are often sold online or through informal distributors, sometimes marketed as exotic, traditional, or medicinal. But without oversight, consumers are effectively drinking something with unknown contents and unknown risk. This is the clearest example of what fake tea really means. Not just low quality, but no accountability, which is why the final part of this video matters most. Knowing how to recognize real tea for yourself, regardless of brand or marketing. How to spot real tea. After seeing how often problems arise from contamination, poor processing, or lack of oversight, the most important skill a tea drinker can have is knowing how to evaluate tea without relying on marketing. One of the first things to look at is leaf quality. Real tea is made from whole or clearly recognizable leaves and herbs, not fine dust or powder. When tea is overly ground, it becomes easier to hide low-grade material and harder to trace quality. If you open a tea bag and can't tell what plant you're looking at, that's usually a red flag. Ingredients matter just as much. High-quality tea keeps ingredient lists simple and specific. Real tea names the plant, the part used, and avoids vague terms like natural flavors, tea blend, or proprietary formulas. The more a label relies on broad language instead of clear ingredients, the less transparent it usually is. Packaging is another overlooked factor. Tea bags are steeped in boiling water, which means the material matters. Brands that openly state they use plastic-free paper bags or encourage loose-leaf tea reduce the risk of unwanted materials ending up in the cup. When brands won't disclose what their bags are made from, that's worth questioning. Sourcing and transparency are also key indicators. Better brands tend to share where their tea comes from, whether that's a region, estate, or specific supplier. This doesn't mean every detail needs to be published, but some level of traceability shows accountability. When a company refuses to share anything beyond marketing slogans, consumers are left guessing. Finally, it helps to remember that organic, a natural, or premium are not guarantees on their own. They only mean something when backed by clear sourcing, testing, and processing standards. Real tea doesn't need exaggerated health promises or dramatic claims. Its quality is visible, its ingredients are clear, and its production is treated with care. Knowing these basics makes it much harder to be misled, no matter which brand you're standing in front of. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know in the comments what tea brands you currently drink, or what you've noticed when comparing products. Sharing this video can also help people who assume all tea is automatically safe just because it's tea. And if you want more clear, research-based breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe. There's a lot more hiding in everyday products than most people realize.